Good evening, my friends. We are continuing with this wonderful commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. But first, we're going to have a nice period of chanting. So let's begin with a prayer, and then we'll have the music. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence within us, to know that we live in this world not alone, but always in divine company. Help us to respond always to the merest whisper of your guidance, that everything we do brings us closer to your light, to your joy, to your infinite love. Om, peace. Amen.
Surrounded me, is giving me lots of trouble, my Lord, is giving me lots of trouble, my Lord. That enemy I will deceive, remaining in the castle of peace, night and day in thy joy, night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. What will be my fate? Oh Lord, tell me. Pranayam be thy religion. Pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing dream. Pranayam is the wishing dream. Pranayam is the wishing dream. Pranayam is beloved God. Pranayam is Creator Lord. Pranayam is the cosmic world. Pranayam is the cosmic world. Pranayam is the cosmic world. Control a little pranayam, become all pervading pranayam. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. Desire of my great enemy, with his soldiers surrounded me, is giving me lots of trouble, my Lord, is giving me lots of trouble, my Lord. That enemy I will deceive, remaining in the castle of peace, night and day in thy joy, O my Lord, night enemy with his soldiers surrounding me. He's giving me lots of trouble. He's giving me lots of trouble. My Lord, that enemy I will deceive, remaining in the castle of peace. Night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord. What will be my fate, oh Lord, tell me. Pranayam be thy religion. Pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is beloved God. Pranayam is Creator Lord. Pranayam is the cosmic world. Pranayam is a cosmic world. Pranayam is the cosmic world. Control a little pranayam. Become the pervading pranayama. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. beloved God. Pranayama is Creator Lord. Pranayama is the cosmic world. Pranayama is the cosmic world. Pranayama is the cosmic world. Control a little pranayama. Become all-pervading pranayama. You won't have to fear anything anymore. 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 Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything My Krishna is blue, the tamar tree is blue. My Krishna is blue, the tamar tree is blue. So I do love thee, tamar tree. So I do love thee, my tamar tree. tammal trees bloom. My Krishna is blue. The tammal trees bloom. So I do love thee, tammal tree. So I do love thee, my tammal tree. And when I die, oh mother, do put me high on a branch of the tammal tree. On a branch of the tammal tree, where Krishna sat, there I would die. Where Krishna sat, there I would die. On a branch of the tammal tree. On a branch of the tammal tree. My Krishna is blue. The tammal tree is blue. My Krishna is blue. The tammal tree is blue. So I do love thee, tammal tree. So I do love thee, my tammal tree. Where Krishna sat, there I would die. 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 On a branch of the tammal tree. On a branch of the tammal tree.
Om, peace. Amen. Well, that's a nice way to begin, isn't it? So, my friends, we are in chapter 6 of the Gita, verse 37, the chapter of the commentary called the True Yoga, chapter 18 of the commentary. So, chapter 6, verse 37 of the Gita says, Arjuna says, O Krishna, what happens to one who is unsuccessful in yoga practice, who tries devotedly to meditate, but finds himself unable to bring his mind under control? That's a good question. That would be a question some of us might like to ask Krishna. So Arjuna goes on in verse 38. Does he not become like a riven cloud, scattered and dispersed, unable to find Brahman, and equally unable to return to the delusory world he rejected? This is like the concern that we all have. You commit yourself to a life of renunciation, and you make consistent decisions that turn you toward the spirit and turn you away from the world. And the feeling grows stronger in oneself, of vairagya, of disinclination for the world, and stronger for the things of the spirit. And also, as time passes, one makes practical choices. One ends up perhaps without financial support, without a home, conceivably without a family, without a profession. But if at the end of it you haven't found God, or haven't become so securely anchored in the spirit that one senses the victory is imminent, then one has neither the divine nor the worldly. He says, becomes like a riven cloud, scattered and dispersed, unable to find Brahman, God, and at the infinite, and equally unable to return to the desultory world. Delusory, what did he say? Delusory world. So verse 39, Arjuna says to Krishna, please release me permanently, O Krishna, from these doubts. Who else but you can banish my uncertainty? The doubts are the fear to commit oneself to this effort because of anticipating that this is going to be a problem. That's why he calls it a doubt. It's not something that has actually happened, but it's something that he fears might happen because all of the promises that have been leading up to this, all these verses, the man of wisdom, the man of God, the man of perfect renunciation, all of these conditions are described, and all of them are based on having complete mastery over your consciousness. But now Arjuna is saying to Krishna, but I don't have that mastery. So all the promises that you're making, they're not going to apply to me, or at least I fear they never will. So Arjuna pleads with Krishna to save him from that fate. Doubt is a very particular kind of illness. And what it does is it undercuts one's efforts, because you're determined to put out all your will behind this certain something, but then this what if comes to you. And then all of a sudden, you can't put your energy in that way, but you're also, you don't really have an alternative to it. So in other places in the Gita, it says the doubter is the most miserable of mortals. Because you hear the truth and you hear the truth, you know it's true, but just before you put your foot on it, then you become afraid. I have this weird intermittent, I guess vertigo is what you call it, fear of heights. It's not dizziness, it's fear of heights. And when it overcomes me, I'm sort of helpless. I was walking, about a week ago, I was visiting some friends, and we were walking on this little path on a hillside, and all of a sudden it became somewhat steeper and more narrow. There wasn't an ounce of danger in it. But somehow I panicked, and my heart began to pound, and my friend, fortunately, was very confident and very strong, and he just took me by the hand and sort of got me over that patch. But I realized that what happened to me was that I just suddenly doubted my ability to go forward without disaster striking me. I completely lost faith. It happened to me once when I was in Israel, and we were at Qumran, which is the remnants of an Essene community out in the desert. And there's a big hillside, and there's a little trail on the hillside. You climb up, and then you're halfway up the hill. The trail was 3 feet wide, but it went like this, and then it turned. And I was toward the front. And when I saw the trail turn, and I couldn't see it anymore, I simply panicked. And there was like 25 people behind me, but I turned, and I just started running as fast as I could back through the crowd. Fortunately, the tour guide, who was also a big, strong man, grabbed my wrist, just grabbed me like that. And as soon as he was holding on to me and I felt his strength, the panic went away from me. Now, that's not exactly what happens to a doubting yogi, but doubt is like that. We're just going along, and we think that we know what we're doing, and then just this irrational panic comes in. So here's Arjuna. He's been following Krishna all this time. He's followed him onto the battlefield. He's in every way surrendered to him. But all of a sudden, this irrational fear grabs him, and so he asks Krishna, promise me, save me from this doubt that I have that all of this is going to turn into nothing. And this is something that every devotee has to face time and again, self-doubt. Maybe it comes in two ways. Either one doubts the efficacy of the path entirely. Maybe it just isn't true, but more deeply is that it's true for everyone but me. And whereas other people's lives will end gloriously, I fear that mine won't. So now, because this is so common and so profoundly and deeply real, and so utterly devastating for your spiritual progress, the commentary here talks in a very interesting way. Swamiji says that there's 3 kinds of failure. The first kind of failure, he says, one of them, alas, is fairly common, simply to return to the world, as Swami puts it, wanly hoping to find somehow again the fulfillment that was denied to him before. Such failed seekers, unfortunately, are all too common. After such a fall, they may wander for incarnations until the desire for God reawakens in their hearts. For although that desire may seem sometimes to have disappeared, once it has been wakened in the heart, it can never die. I've lived in an ashram for over 50 years now, which is a really long time. And I've watched a lot of people come and go. You come in. When I first entered, I found Vedanta when I was 19. I found Swami when I was 22. Even though that was a very young age, because of my avid nature. I'd already sort of either actually literally tested or at least explored in theory many things that the world was supposed to give you. I was an adult, relatively speaking, on my own. I was moving into the adult world. I was no longer a child, sort of waiting for my life to begin. And I had no idea what I was ever going to do that was going to be meaningful. And then I came to Ananda, and I had every hope that this would last longer than anything else had lasted, but I didn't know that it would or not. So it has, of course, from the moment that I committed myself to Swamiji, I've never actually had a moment of actual doubt. So it wasn't that I doubted, but that I feared doubt might overcome me. Or I feared that in some other way I would fail. Whether I failed or not remains to be seen, but in the sense of that it would just dry up for me. And all I'm saying is that I understand that. It never happened to me, but I understand it. And I watched many of my friends that just so much zeal at the beginning, so much commitment, so much courage, so much renunciation, so much faith, all of these things. And then over time, it just somehow, they just lose energy. Swamiji put it in a different way, which is how he spoke to us when we were first beginning to become ministers, to operate in a position of some leadership. And some of us were traveling, I was traveling, or we'd begun to open branch centers in various places. So Swamiji wasn't standing there with us to be the focal point of people's expectations. Some of us were standing in that position. And Swami, inevitably, we had that experience that people would come with tremendous enthusiasm, and then after a time they would just go away. And Swami said, only some people have lifelong spiritual karma. He said the majority of people just have some spiritual karma, and it awakens, and they run to the spiritual path. They believe that their commitment is going to endure, but at a certain point the karma just sort of runs out, and other desires come, and they go somewhere, wherever they might go. And he said to us very strongly, he said, don't take it personally. Don't feel that it's a personal failure on your part that you aren't able to keep inspiring them, because the inspiration is within them. So people will, the first kind of failure, and failure in this sense means lack of total liberation, is that they try it for a while, the energy wanes, and then they go back to the world. And depending on the strength of their commitment, it may be, as Master says here, many incarnations before they get up the courage to try again. But he does say inevitably they will, because you can't possibly fail forever. Because once it has come into your consciousness that God is the answer, everything else that happened will be measured against that. And sooner or later that divine commitment will be reawakened. So, another type of fall takes place, so to speak, on the battlefield. A person practices yoga zealously at first, but after some time he relaxes his effort. Having at first been carried along by his initial zeal, a lack of perfect non-attachment in the heart may cause him to become discouraged and to lessen his efforts, thereby making him lose his focus on soul bliss. When death comes, his mind, influenced by past worldly karmas, looks back with reawakened interest upon the worldly pleasures he once enjoyed. Distracted consequently from his one-pointed longing for God, he falls short of union with him. Self-doubt assails him. Does he really want to find God? Might it not satisfy him to attain something less challenging, a harmonious life in an astral heaven? Is he perhaps not fit to scale the heights? Is there possibly no hope for him to rise higher? In such a state of mind, the aspiring yoga would do best not to be too analytical. He should simply love God and leave the decision as to his fate in the hands of the divine. Nishkam karma, action without desire for the fruits of action, should be his motto all the way to and beyond the door of death. So what we have to understand here is that we've tried zealously, we have worked as hard as we can. We know the end of the incarnation is coming, and the self-mastery we had hoped for. Just like Arjuna said, the mind is still running wild. And so then we begin to think, I'm just not capable of doing this. I'm just going to have to settle for less. So this is where the answer that Master gives us is extremely important. He said, just nishkam karma. Nishkam karma means action without desire for the fruits of it. This is this, and this goes on, and this is extremely important here. The point that Swami makes here. We can't be seeking God because of what we think we're going to get. And it's a very strange paradox. Of course, we want to be on the spiritual path. We want to do these practices because we have this belief that the end of all our seeking is going to be perfect joy. But you can't always be saying, have I made it yet? Have I made it yet? I didn't quite make it. Maybe I'm not going to make it. Because that perfect joy comes from self-forgetfulness. And this is a very subtle point. We think it comes from self-perfection. But even the idea that I'm going to become perfect, which I know is the word Jesus used, be ye therefore perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. But even the preoccupation with whether or not I am making spiritual progress is antithetical to making spiritual progress. We have to just do what is right because it's right to do, because it's dharma, and then we have to leave the rest in God's hands. It's not as hard to do as you think, because after a while we realize that we have no way of measuring. We have no way even of knowing what success looks like, what to speak of being able in any way to evaluate our particular state of mind. And you could also, you might just be at the very end of a very difficult bit of karma that's just about finally to clear, and then you'll be free. Master made a reference. There was a woman at Mount Washington who was deeply plagued by longing for human love and human relationships. And finally she just gave up and left the monastic life and went back to the world. Master said if she'd held on for 24 more hours, then the karma would have been finished. Of course, it was reaching its crescendo, but you always think of that, wow, just 24 more hours. So you just don't know. You might think that you're just in the throes of the pit of confusion and desire and attachment, and you might actually just about be done with it. But you just have to hold on through the last little bit. But the most important thing you have to do is so what? It's just like, so what? Whether I'm good or bad or not, so what? I'll come back to that in a moment. The third type of failure, so the first type is that we just gradually lose energy and we just go back to the world. We try out the spiritual path for a while, but it just doesn't feed us, so we go off to be ambitious for something else. And we have to wait then until the spiritual wave comes in again, which it may be several incarnations before it does. But it will, because it can't help but do so. The second way to fail is that we try hard, we don't succeed in the way we think we were supposed to succeed, so we just lose heart for the whole battle and just think this isn't for me. And the answer to that one, Master says, is leave it to God. Just love God and leave the results in His hands. Then the third type of failure is simply to have fallen short, so far, of perfection. Such a person may remain for a long time amid the beauties of the astral heaven, which, when he returns to earth, will remain with him subconsciously as a constant reminder that this world is not his true home. Or he may return quickly to earth, filled with the zeal to continue his search for God. In his next life, he may begin his spiritual efforts again at a young age and never rest until the divine goal is attained. Alternatively, he may fail to reach perfection, but be liberated at least from earthly karma and continue his quest for perfection on the astral plane. So that's where one is not discouraged, one has not lost interest in the spiritual path, one has done one's best, but just there's more karma to expiate. It just hasn't all been resolved. And such a person may go to a very high astral world and live in a very blissful state of spiritual happiness. So let me just see, there's another point. Swami, Master then talks about how spiritual growth is like a seed that you plant. And when you plant a seed, you bury it under the ground, and planting a seed is an act of faith based on experience or the testimony of those you trust. You put the seed in the ground, you cover it up, and then you water it and take care of it, but you can't see it growing. And after a period of time, it emerges. And as Master often talks about, if you plant a seed and then constantly dig it up and look at it and then put it back in the ground, you'll kill it. It'll never grow. And that is, to a certain extent, what happens if we're thinking all the time, am I making progress? Am I making progress? And instead of directing our attention then toward the divine, our attention is always, what about me? What about me? What about me? And then egotism just overtakes devotion. So Swami writes here, and this is a paragraph in this book that I'm glad to know exactly where it is. It's on page 280, because I knew it was in here, but I lost track of where it was. He says, act as you should for the present and leave the results in God's hands, what we said before. Whether you succeed in finding Him in this life, or must find Him in another, or even wait several more lifetimes, these things should not be your present concern. Think only how many incarnations you built up an opposite momentum. It takes time to break into the vastness of eternity from the hard shell you have created over many lives. Be content to do your best for now and leave the results in God's hands. Now, this is how I have always lived. It just seemed more sensible to me. The reason I'm saying this is because on occasion, Swami has exhorted us and said, you can at least, even if you can't realize God, you can at least become a jivan mukta in this life, meaning you can break the self-definition of being a separate ego. You may still have some karma that you have to resolve, but no more karma will accrue because you've broken the delusion of ego. And he sometimes has exhorted us to do this, and at times Master has exhorted us to do this. And often I have said the opposite, that I do not feel myself aided by the thought that, yes, I can become a jivan mukta. I find myself aided by the words that are exactly in this paragraph. And I remember when Swami wrote this commentary, he wrote it over like 2 months, which was an extremely short period of time, when he was living in India in this house he had in Gurgaon, which he had for the first couple of years that he was living in India. And during that time, he had about 30 different visitors from America and Europe. And I was one of them for a week or 10 days. I don't know how long I was there. And every day, Swami would write 10 manuscript pages of this book, and he would put them down on the coffee table in the living room, and they would always be there in the morning. And when we would come into the house or come downstairs, if I was staying there, I don't recall, and we would read what he had written for the day. And I remember reading this paragraph in the manuscript, and I brought to him exactly what I just said to you. I said, Swamiji, I know there's this exhortation to become free, but I've always found that just makes me worried. That makes me worried exactly like the second kind of failure, which is, this is what I'm supposed to do, but I don't feel I can do it. This is too much for me. So I find myself much happier if I just forget it. And also it's like, I can say these words and I can even read in parts of this book what it means to be a Jivan Mukta or a Siddha or a Paramukta and all these different things. But I don't have any actual experience of what that is. It's just like, there's certain things that I know. Earlier today I was making a different recording for a different purpose, and in the same context, I was actually talking about the same subject, what it means to be a Jivan Mukta. And I was contrasting it like this. I've been making chocolate chip cookies since my early 20s. And over the course of all these years, I've got the recipe down just right. And the cookies come out really well. I know exactly how to make those cookies. I know how to cream the butter and the sugar just right together. And I mean, making chocolate chip cookies is not a very hard thing to do. I was a health food fanatic for a number of years. And I always thought anybody can make something good with butter and sugar. The art of real cooking is to have no good ingredients and still make something good. I mean, from the point of view of health. So it's no great accomplishment, but I know exactly how to do it. I can talk about it. I can tell what's good and bad about a cookie because I have experience of it. And I worked on that recipe and I got it just right. Okay? And I can talk about Jivan Mukta. I can talk about being free of karma, but I have no experience of it. So I can't hold it with the same kind of authority that I can hold other things. So when Swami tells us, I mean, it's a ridiculous dichotomy between chocolate chip cookies and being a Jivan Mukta, but not really. It clearly tells me I really don't know what it is to be free. I can't look at it and know what it is. So I don't even know where I am in any of this. And Ramakrishna was a remarkably unusual avatar. He was said to be an avatar. And there was a time, let's see, how did all this work? Ramakrishna was an avatar who died just about the time Master was born, the very end of the 1800s. And in the latter part of the 1800s. And he lived in a temple devoted to Kali outside of Calcutta. And he was very peculiar. He was just very eccentric. Some people thought he was a saint. Some people thought he was mad. It just depended which side you were on. And this woman came, this woman sadhu, who was also a scholar and an authority. She became convinced that Ramakrishna was in fact a siddha, an avatar. And she called a conference of religious authorities, famous scholars and famous interpreters of the scriptures. There would be the right words for it all, but I don't know. But let's just say they were highly respected, highly evolved souls who understood the ancient writings and could speak. And she presented the case that Ramakrishna was an avatar. She presented it to them, and they all consulted the scriptures to decide whether or not he was. And she had all the arguments about why he was. This is apparently something that happens in that wonderful country at that particular time, that such a conference would be convened. And Ramakrishna sat and listened to the whole discussion. And their conclusion was that he was, in fact, an avatar. And then he went back, because you have this book called the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, in which this wonderful devotee of his wrote down all the things that happened when he was present. And so then Ramakrishna sort of says to his disciples, "What do you know? They think I'm an avatar." And just like a little child, isn't that remarkable? That's who they think I am. And he wasn't mocking it. He was just so uninvolved in the question because there was no self to be involved in it. It was complete self-transcendence, which the beginning of that is self-forgetfulness. So when we're always asking ourselves, am I advanced? Am I advancing? Have I done enough? Am I good enough? Am I going to be able to succeed? I only have another decade and I have to make it to Jivan Mukta. It just, to my mind, it never helped me. to think like that ever. I think I was subject to the second kind of failure, which is that I'm not capable of doing this. So the power that I think one develops, and it sort of comes up as we go through this a little more, is what else would I do? It's like one has left one's home. One has left the world as one's home. The world is no longer one's home. The vairagya has come. The disinclination for the things of this world have become too deep. You know, there's one can be entertained, perhaps briefly, but one simply cannot commit oneself seriously to pursuing the things that the material world tells you you have to do to be happy. That doesn't mean you don't do your dharma. If you have children to raise, if you have a family to care for, if you have a destiny of some sort that you know you have to follow, a career or artistic or whatever it might be, doesn't mean you don't follow it. It doesn't mean that you don't give every ounce of your energy to it. But you do it because God has sent you to do it, not because you think, oh, this is how I'm going to be happy. You do it out of the love of God, love for God, the love of Dharma, the love of truth. This is the assignment that I've been given, and I will do it well. There's a couple at Ananda who've been married for probably 40 or 50 years now. And at least this is how the story is told. When he first married his wife, they met and married at Ananda. Both are deep renunciates, utterly dedicated to the spiritual life, and have lived accordingly. He just said to his wife when they got married, he said, now I want you to understand that I consider being your husband a job. Not a very romantic, but she loved him for who he was. I consider it a job. And then he quickly added, now don't misunderstand, I intend to do a good job. And he has done a stellar job. But he just wanted her to understand. And she respected him, and in fact felt the same way. You know, this is something that we have to do, and we'll do it well. But we're not doing it because we hold out some false hope that just by doing this, we'll find perfect happiness. By doing this as devotees, by doing this as yogis, happiness will come to us, but not from outside ourselves, only from inside ourselves. So that's what Swami says. But then Swami says this other part, which is also exceedingly important. And the way he puts it, he said, the path to God is not like plodding wearily over a barren desert in hope of finding an oasis. Every step of the way becomes more beautiful, verdant, flowery, and infinitely varied. In other words, life refines and life becomes more beautiful. It's not like trudge, nothing, and then everything happens. It's rather that we just gradually shift. And what one finds that, it's sort of like almost with a little bit of surprise. Now this is especially true, or this is true on Master's path. And I don't know about how it works in other places, but I know there are a lot of practices or quasi-spiritual practices where, you know, you go for this weekend retreat and you have a big release, or you have a big thing like this happen, a big emotional moment, which sometimes, you know, can be cathartic. But much of the time, the transformation doesn't hold because it's more emotionally based than actually a transformation from the inside. And I mean, it may still have some benefit, but it's not the same. On a path like Kriya Yoga, where we are following, you know, practices and understandings, where we're genuinely shifting the karmic pattern in our spines, rarely does change happen in one dramatic moment. What usually happens is it's literally like a drop of water on a stone. It's like it doesn't seem like anything is happening. But then time passes, and sometimes years pass. I don't always like to tell people how many years have to pass. And then you will just suddenly, something will happen, and you'll realize that your responses are entirely different than they used to be. And you can't actually say when that shift took place, because you yourself just have transformed into something else. And only when you look back do you realize how much is different than it used to be. And that's the kind of transformation that never has this gigantic cathartic moment, or rarely, but that's the kind of transformation where you simply become someone else, and the seeds of karma have been burned, and they're finished, they're behind you, and this is who you will be from now on. So the first kind of failure that was described is that the spiritual path just fails to hold our attention. And because it fails to hold our attention, we find ourselves distracted and interested in something else. You know, it often happens that the pretty young girl or the handsome man comes in and, oh, you know, they're not really on the path, but they're so spiritual, or whatever it might be. And, you know, 5 years later, you find yourself, I was very struck by this man that I met a few years ago. He had lived in our community decades ago. A very nice man. Swamiji was very impressed by him. A woman wanders in. He becomes infatuated with her. She becomes determined to capture him. Swamiji himself didn't want to risk speaking to the man directly because he wasn't sure that the man could listen. But he asked someone else to say, you know, she's a nice woman, but she's not going to help you spiritually. That's what Swamiji said. She's a nice woman, but she's not going to help you spiritually. I don't think the person who spoke to him put Swamiji's name on that statement, because Swamiji did not use his authority casually. And he would never use his authority to coerce someone who wasn't asking. But Swami tried by indirect means to dissuade him. He wouldn't be dissuaded, so he went off with her. I didn't hear from him for 25 or 30 years. And then one day he just showed up at our temple. And he looked so tired. You know, he didn't look radiant and free. And he just sort of stood in front of me, and I said, you know I know who you are, but I can't remember. So he told me his name. Oh, he'd had several children. He'd raised his children. He'd had a career in some, I want to say Pepsi-Cola, some company, just a corporate job, and he'd been successful. But he didn't have the look in his eyes that he'd had before. He just got drawn away. And this happens. It's nothing to, it happens. It just happens. This is why it takes us a long time. There's several people who are living in one of our ashrams now who went away for 25 or 30 years and then came back. And my regard for such people is limitless. You know, to take such a long loop, trying to sort of find satisfaction elsewhere, and then realize that I need to go back to where I started. And, you know, just come back with whole heart. I've seen some remarkable individuals who have done just that. Why not? If this is what we really want. And what we have to cultivate within ourselves is just that constant realization that if I just put one foot in front of the other. And then what happens is we just really do begin to see that this path works. When those of us who've been trained in America have gone to India and been put in a position where we're having to teach the ancient Indian teachings to modern day Indians, it's sometimes you have to sort of get used to what's expected of you. And one of the questions that we are sometimes asked is, what is your state of realization? Because there's a tradition, that you have to be instructed by a God-realized person. What is your state of realization? So someone asked Jaya that, what have you gained or what have you realized? Oh, what siddhi do you have? What power have you developed? That was the question. What powers have you developed? Can you walk on water? I don't know what the question was. Can you raise the dead? Can you turn water into wine? What siddhis have you developed? Because powers are the proof of realization. And Jaya, being very honest and very thoughtful, and again, I'm telling the story as it was told to me. At first he said, either said nothing, or he said, I haven't developed any siddhis. Because on Master's path, that's not how it develops for us usually. But he either didn't answer or he repudiated it, but then eventually this is what he said. I've developed the power to choose happiness. Now, when you think about that, that is a really phenomenal power to have. I know that great saints have repudiated powers because, so you can walk across the river, and as the allegory goes, so you can walk across the river on top of the water. You can also give the ferryman a rupee, and he'll row you across. What have you really gained? But when you've gained the power to choose happiness, then you have a portable paradise that you always have with you to come what may. And that's a power worth having. And that's the flowering of the desert that Swami's talking about. It's not like you're miserable, 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 and then you have divine bliss. It's like step by step you become freer and freer and freer. That's what I've watched in my own life, just especially in the last decade or less. It's sort of like it all comes together every once in a while. I remember from and this was 12 years. I came when I was 24, and I remember when I turned 36. And the only way I can say it is that my conscious mind was just slightly oriented toward the negative is what I want to think of. I remained, I don't want to exaggerate what happened when I was 36, because it was by no means freedom. But I was very high-strung and very self-concerned, pretty much until very recently. Diminishing as time went by, but by no means really going away. When I was 24 to 36, I was very high-strung, and so therefore I had a very easy tendency. The orientation of my mind was toward tension. When I turned 36, it's almost like I remember on my birthday, practically, it began to orient slightly in a more positive direction. Now, you might think that's nothing, but it was just huge. It was like, whereas before I had been walking uphill, at least I was walking on level ground. It didn't really turn into an easy slide, but just like that, just enough strain went out of the system that I could begin to really function. This is what he's saying here. The desert begins to flower. And even just a little bit of that experience just shuts the door on abandoning the path. It just slams the door against giving up. And all you have to do is not give up. And the rest is God's problem. I would joke, some people, especially in the early years with Swamiji, they would sort of not be sure about what Swami had to offer, and they felt more certain of what Master had to offer, so they kind of tried to push Swami off to one side and just go directly to Master. That's a long story, and I talk about it in my book, Light Bearer. I won't talk about it here. But the way I always felt about that was the difference between Swamiji and Master was not something I could perceive. I received what I understood to be Master's teachings and his vibrations through the gift of Swami's presence in my life. And if Swami was telling me this was not Swami, this was Master, he was offering me, this was his teachings, fine, I don't care what you call it. You know, this is what is coming to me. So I wasn't worried about that. The difference between me and Swamiji was so obvious and so enormous that I figured I would close that gap first and then I would worry about the rest of it. It was the same sort of thing. It's like, this is not my issue. In fact, when I very first came to live at Ananda Village, Ananda Retreat at the time, I had been very deeply devoted to Sri Ramakrishna, which is, I was speaking of him. I for the first 3 years of my understanding of self-realization, it came entirely through my study of Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. And I felt Ramakrishna's presence very powerfully in my life, and I had a few profound experiences where I knew he was taking care of me. And I still have this deep affection. And I believe I understand the word correctly, but the word I finally learned was upaguru, which means, it can mean a true guru, a self-realized master, but one who is taking care of you for a time, who will deliver you to where you belong. So my relationship with Ramakrishna was very real. And then I met Swami, and then Swami is a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, and the entire life of Ananda, Kriya, initiation, everything, was based on a discipleship relationship with Yogananda. So I felt a little, I didn't know what to do. My relationship with Swami was crystal clear. Where he was, I would be. An igloo in Antarctica, it didn't matter. Where he was, I would be. But I didn't know how to deal with this Yogananda Ramakrishna thing. And so I just said to them, I said to them in a meditation, basically, I have no idea. I'm completely sincere. I obviously belong here. This has certain conditions. Ananda has certain conditions. I don't know what I should do. I said, you guys figure it out. And that's really what I said. And then I just committed myself completely to learning from Swami and following the life at Ananda as I understood it. And about a year later, I woke up one morning and I said, well, of course, you couldn't belong to Swami this way if you didn't also belong to Master, to Yogananda. That was that. But it was beyond me. And that's how I feel about being a Jivan Mukta. It's just beyond me. But there are so many things in front of me that are not beyond me. My sadhana, my devotion, my right attitude, my everythingness. All of them I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And if those lead me, where else would they be leading to me? How far distance, whether I will arrive, how many incarnations? Who cares? This is a very important paragraph in this book. And actually, when I said to Swami, I said, sir, I've had this discussion with many people. I said, I feel that this is the only way to go. And Swami wrote it, so you can see. He has, at other times, exhorted us to try to become Jivan Muktas, because he's often talking to many different people at the same time. Which is why you have to be careful about just quoting the words. That's what it means when even the devil can quote the scripture. That's not because the devil will twist the words. It's because the satanic force will try to persuade you of something that is not in your best interest. And the path of self-realization is not a dogmatic path. And yes, Master may have said it. Those may be his exact words. He may have said exactly that. But this is why Swami called his book the Art and Science of Raja Yoga, which is the fundamental course that he wrote back in the early 70s. Because there's the science in which you can say this is how it works, but the science only works if you use it artistically. And to use it artistically, you have all the colors in the paint box, but you can't just put all the colors on the canvas because you won't end up with anything beautiful. So you have all these scientific dogmas, principles over here, all of which are true, but you can't just throw them all on the canvas. You have to look at it, and you have to think, given who I am, given these circumstances, given the unique dharma of the moment, these are the things that apply. And you can't then just say, well, Master says X, Y, Z, which people do. Quoting the Master out of context and applying it in the wrong way is just the same as misquoting him. That's how the devil quotes Scripture. He uses it to suppress, not to uplift. I remember a friend of mine made himself crazy with a few things that Master said, which he said. They were right there. The words were exactly there. And he said to me later, because they set him up. They set him up to do things that were not karmically appropriate for him to do, is the only way I can say it. To develop abilities he didn't have. See, this is where, when you're just looking at dogma, you get mixed up. You need sensitive inner guidance, not just dogmatic words. And he sort of said something to me like, well, why didn't you try to follow those? And my answer was, it never occurred to me that those concepts, those precepts applied to me. I said, it never once occurred to me that I should try to live according to those particular instructions. They didn't fit me. And I mean, I did it intuitively. I also did it out of cowardice. But I knew my limits. I guess that's what I would say. Not my sincerity. My sincerity is enormous. But my limits. I've joked with friends of mine that I've never had a lot of endurance. I've developed much more. I've developed a lot in the last few years especially. Every 12 years you shift. And now I've gone through past the age of 72, which has been another cumulative 12-year cycle, double what I had when I was 36. But I've never had a lot of endurance. And so as a consequence, I can't take dogmas. I can't even consider dogmas that require that you endure like this. I just don't have it in me. Haven't had it in me. More so now. But as a result, I'm very, very creative. Because when I'm up against something I can't stand, I have to find another way to deal with it. I just have to be able to look at a situation and find another dharmic and progressive solution. I can't be boxed in by a dogma that I can't do. This is how we work with ourselves. And then I have to say, Master, this is who I am. And you're just going to have to work with me. Because this is who I am. I remember once Swamiji had given me a certain instruction. And by that point in my life, I knew it was very important to be very honest with him. Earlier than that, I would try to pretend. But I'd reached the point where absolute honesty with Swamiji was my first priority. So he asked me to do this certain thing, and I couldn't do it. It just was beyond me to do it. I didn't have the discipline or the endurance. So I had to say to him, sir, you recommended that I follow this certain course of action, but I want you to know I'm not doing it. Swami, this is how I felt about it. He didn't take an extra breath. He didn't breathe in and sigh. He didn't look to the heavens. He just said, well, so much for theory. Let's deal with reality. That's all he said. Then he gave me an alternate suggestion, which I could follow, and I did. Just like that. Oh, well, that was a nice idea, but now let's do this instead. Either, we leave it to God. We don't, you see, and this is why when that man was infatuated with that woman who wasn't spiritually good for him, she was fine for him in a worldly sense. They made a life. Most people would think it was a great success. And I'm really not going to say one way or another. I wished he had looked happier when I saw him again. I only saw him that once. He never came back. And even then he was sort of sneaking out from his wife to visit Ananda again. But the reason Swami did not directly confront that man, this was something that I watched over many years. Swamiji knew that the most important thing was for him to maintain the trust of those souls that Master had sent to him to guide. And not everybody who passed through Ananda belonged to Swami, but I believe this man did. And Swamiji knew that he needed to, at all costs, to preserve the relationship. Let the man go off and, fritter away much of this incarnation in a vain attempt to find worldly happiness. That was fine. It was a time waster, but that's all it was. That's all. But if somehow or another the man lost his connection to Swami out of shame or embarrassment or anger, Swami asked something of him that he couldn't do, and then in order to protect his self-esteem, he had to repudiate Swamiji. This happens a lot, you see. As Swami put it, most people who come and go from Ananda, they pass through and it remains, they forget about it, or it remains a kind of distant, pleasant memory. And then Swami said, there are others, as he put it, upon whom Ananda has such a profound effect that they, even after they leave it, they cannot put it down. And if they, in their hearts, feel that they have spiritually fallen, they have to make Ananda and Swami Kriyananda wrong. Because if Swamiji wasn't wrong, then they were wrong. So Swami is very careful in many circumstances, in most circumstances, to do everything he can to what I call preserve the relationship. And just let the person run, because if the relationship is still in place, then however long the loop, at some other incarnation, they'll come back, either directly to Swamiji or to whatever incarnated form there is that is the same ray to bring them back. So, because what that does is that preserves the person's, you don't feel like a failure. You've just, Swami is still my friend. I can still speak to him. So coming to that, I had learned in my life with Swami, because at the beginning, I just tried to look good. And after that didn't work, Swami said once, you never fooled me. And I thought, oh my God, what a colossal waste of energy. So after that, I just was what I was. Let me phrase it more clearly. I did the best I could, to be honest. Self-honesty is a very difficult quality to acquire. So I was honest as I was able to be. And I tried to be as open as I could be with Swamiji. So much for theory. Let's deal with reality, because there's always a way to go forward. See, this is how we stay in the spiritual path. It's not an absolute. It's just we keep going forward. Swami writes, we become discouraged because we have false expectations. In the legal field, I'm not a lawyer, but we had a number of years of litigation against Ananda, and I worked during those 12 years closely with the lawyers. So there was a concept that I learned, which was called the Strawman defense, or something like that. Now my words are I'm not entirely clear, but the phrase Strawman was in there, which is, it's a technique of making a legal argument, which is you create a straw man. You say, this is the issue, and then you dismantle that issue. And then you try to persuade the judge that you've actually repudiated the claim. But it's a straw man. It's just you drag it across, and then you dismantle it, and you try to connect what you've done with what you've just created. But you haven't done anything at all because it doesn't relate. So what happens to us on the spiritual path, the simple word is false expectations. But we create a straw man. We create an idea of what I'm supposed to accomplish and what it's supposed to look like. And then what my expectation is not fulfilled, and therefore I think I've failed. But the problem is that the expectation that you created for yourself was false from the beginning. And the fact that it was not fulfilled means nothing. It was a straw man. It didn't mean anything. The chief reason people get discouraged is that they have expectation of specific results. Learn to expect nothing. And it's all related to the other. Learn to expect nothing. Because what do I really know about what God realization actually looks like? This is it. This is what I said. I don't know. But I mean, you're not completely brainless, but we think in this period of time, this should happen after this much meditation, it should look like this. I should be free in this way. I still have these passions and desires. I still get angry. I don't know. How much karma do I have left? Master put it, if you have a nail in the wall, but you didn't put the nail in the wall, or you don't remember putting it in the wall, and you try to pull it out, is there half an inch of the nail in the wall? Is it a 10-inch nail? You just don't know. You just start pulling on it. And if it doesn't come out right away, that doesn't mean you're not pulling properly. It just may mean that the nail is really long. It's just going to take a lot longer. So you may think that your anger ought to be gone by now, but where did that idea come from? It's just like, this is what is required on the spiritual path. This is what I was saying. Self-honesty is a very hard quality to develop. And this is why introspection is so important, and reviewing the field of battle after the day is done. What happened today? Pay attention and just come to know ourselves. So much for theory. Now it's time to deal with reality. Many times people come to me and they're so discouraged and they think they're not doing anything right. I'm just astonished. I'll say, my goodness, you're a completely different person than you were when you came. Or you're just such a bright, beautiful soul. What are you talking about? They just have no idea what it's supposed to be like. But that doesn't keep us from declaring what it should be like. So what really finally happens, is you just throw up your hands. And the surrender comes because you realize it's just folly to have any idea. But that doesn't mean you don't keep trying. It's like, I know where my feet are right now. I can see where my next step is. I know where my heart is right now. I know that I can keep opening it. I know where the friction is right now. I can work on trying to resolve it. It's not like I don't know what to do. I mean, I know what to do every morning. I know every hour. I know what I'm supposed to do. Where is it heading? How much longer will it go on like this? Just like I said to Ramakrishna and Yoganandaji, you know what? I'm going to let you guys figure that out. I love you. I live for you. I do my best. I put my life in your hands. That's the way to live. God bless you.